morning, everyone. I'm Anita Nyeji, as you know, and today we're going to be diving into one of the most important concepts in American democracy, the cornerstone of our country, checks and balances. The system is the reason why our government isn't run by a king, a dictator, or some out-of-control Congress passing laws like a group chat gone wrong. Ever wonder why the president can't just make up laws, or why Congress can't fire Supreme Court justices just because they don't like the ruling? That's checks and balances in action. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how each branch of the government checks the others, and we'll go over some interesting examples like presidents ignoring Congress, Supreme Court's cases that changed America, and even whether TikTok should be banned or not. At the end, we'll have an interesting quiz and a debate question for the class. So join me on this adventure. Let's go. So what are checks and balances? First, let's break it down. Checks and balances is a system where each branch of government has the power to limit the actions of the other branches so no one branch gets too powerful. Let's think of it like a group project with 3 people. Let's call them legislative, executive, and judicial. Each have their different tasks. Legislative, or Congress, writes the project outlines or makes the laws. Executive, the president, pulls the project together or enforces the laws. And judicial, the Supreme Court, reviews the final project or interprets the laws. Now, what happens when one group member tries to do too much or too little? The others step in to balance it out. That's how the US government works. Let's go back in time. The year is 1787. America just won independence from Britain, but our first attempt at government, the Articles of Confederation, was a complete disaster. Congress was too weak, states did whatever they wanted, and there was no president or Supreme Court to enforce laws. So, the Founding Fathers held the Constitutional Convention, where they argued for months about what to do. They didn't want a king like Britain had, but they also didn't want the government to be so weak that it didn't function. That's when they came up with the separation of powers and checks and balances. Inspired by Montesquieu, a French philosopher who believed that dividing government power was the only way to prevent against corruption. Let's review a timeline of key events that helped shape our system. First, in 1748, Montesquieu published his Spirit of Laws, laying the intellectual foundation for separation of powers. In 1787, the U.S. Constitution is written, incorporating these ideas into the structure of our government. In 1788, Federalist Number 51 is published by James Madison, explaining why checks and balances are essential to preserving liberty. In 1803, in Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court establishes the principle of judicial review, empowering it to strike down laws that conflict with the Constitution. Now let's talk a little bit about federalism. I know we already went over this topic on Friday, but federalism, the division of power between national government and state governments, acts as an additional layer of checks and balances. While the 3 branches of the national government check each other, federalism ensures that state governments also have a voice and that power isn't overly centralized. When state laws conflict with federal laws, the courts step in, reinforcing our balanced system of governance. Alright friends, let's take a look at how each of the branches check each other. Let's start off with the legislative checks on the executive. The first is by overriding vetoes. If the president vetoes a bill, Congress can override it with a 3/4 majority vote. For example, in 1973, President Nixon vetoed the War Powers Act, but Congress overrode it. This limited the president's ability to send troops to war without congressional approval. The second one is the power of the purse. Congress controls government spending. For example, in 2019, Congress refused to give President Trump $5.7 billion for his border wall, even after a government shutdown. And the third is impeachment and approval. The House can impeach the president and the Senate can remove them. For example, 3 presidents have been impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, twice, but none were removed from office. All right, let's talk about legislative checks on the judiciary. The first is that Senate confirms judges. The president nominates judges, but the Senate must approve them. For example, in 1987, the Senate rejected Robert Bork's Supreme Court nomination, fearing he was too conservative. The second is impeaching federal judges. Congress can remove judges for misconduct. For example, Justice Samuel Chase in 1804 was impeached but not removed. Now let's talk about executive checks on the legislative. First, it has veto power. The president can reject bills. FDR holds the record for 635 vetoes, the most in history. Next is executive orders. Presidents can issue orders without Congress. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in Confederate states without congressional approval. And the last is calling special sessions. The president can call Congress into emergency meetings. In our history, we saw this take place in 1948 when Truman called a special session to push civil rights legislation. Now, what about executive checks on the judiciary? The first is by appointing judges. Presidents nominate Supreme Court justices. For example, Trump's 3 Supreme Court appointments shifted the court's balance. The second is pardons. The president can pardon federal crimes. For example, President General Ford pardoned Nixon after Watergate. Now let's look at judicial checks on the other 2. First is judicial review. The Supreme Court can strike down unconstitutional laws. For example, during Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, it overturned segregational laws that have been in place for so long. The second is ruling executive actions unconstitutional. For example, in U.S. v. Nixon in 1974, it forced Nixon to release the Watergate tapes. And third is it presides over impeachment trials. For example, Chief Justice John Roberts presided over Trump's impeachment trial. Now, you might be wondering, Anissa, we've been hearing about checks and balances this whole time. We've been seeing how each branch checks each other, but what are some moments in history where we've seen checks and balances in action? Well, don't worry, because I have you covered. The first case we're going to be talking about today is Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Okay, so Marbury v. Madison of 1803. It was a landmark Supreme Court case that established the principle of judicial review, which allows the Supreme Court to declare laws and executive actions unconstitutional. This case played a crucial role in the system of checks and balances, strengthening the judiciary's ability to check the other branches of government. The case arose from the political tensions between the Federalists, led by outgoing President John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, led by the incoming President Thomas Jefferson. In the final days of his presidency, Adams and the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which created new courts and judgeships. Adams quickly appointed several Federalist judges, known as the Midnight Judges, in an effort to maintain Federalist influence in the government. One of these judges was William Marbury, who was appointed as Justice of Peace for Washington, D.C. However, when Jefferson took office, his Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver Marbury's official commission, preventing him from taking the position. In response, Marbury sued Madison and asked for the Supreme Court to issue a writ of mandamus, which would have forced Madison to deliver the commission. Chief Justice John Marshall, a Federalist, faced a difficult decision. The court had to determine 3 key questions. First, did Marbury have the right to his commission? The court ruled yes. Once appointed, Marbury had the legal right to take his position. Second, did Madison violate Marbury's right by refusing to deliver the commission? Again, the court ruled yes. By withholding the commission, Madison broke the law. However, the third and most critical question was, did the Supreme Court have the authority to issue a writ of mandamus? In this case, surprisingly, the court ruled no. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which gave the Supreme Court the power to issue such a writ, was unconstitutional. This ruling was a brilliant move by Marshall. By declaring part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional, the Supreme Court established the power of judicial review, giving itself the authority to strike down laws and executive actions that violate the Constitution. At the same time, the decision allowed Marshall to avoid a direct political confrontation with Jefferson, ensuring that the judiciary would maintain its independence. This case is the perfect example of checks and balances in action. The judicial branch checked the legislative branch by striking down a law passed by Congress, demonstrating that laws must align with the Constitution. It also checked the executive branch by ruling against the Jefferson administration, though it stopped short of ordering Madison to act. Before Marbury v. Madison, the judiciary was seen as the weakest branch of government. This decision changed everything, making the Supreme Court an equal player in the system of government and shaping the balance of power that still exists today. The next case we're going to be talking about is the Watergate scandal. This happened in 1972 to 1974. For context, Nixon's campaign was caught spying on Democratic offices, and how checks and balances worked, where the legislative branch investigated Nixon, the judicial branch ruled Nixon must release the tapes, but Nixon ended up resigning before he could be impeached. Let's talk a little bit more about one of the biggest political scandals in American history, Watergate. This wasn't just some petty crime, it was a full-blown constitutional crisis that put the system of checks and balances to the test, and ultimately proved that no president is above the law. So what really happened? In 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. It turned out that these men were working for President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, and their mission was to steal confidential information and bug the offices. That alone was bad enough, but the real issue wasn't the break-in in itself. It was the cover-up. Nixon and his administration used federal agencies like the FBI and CIA to obstruct the investigation, trying to hide their involvement. But reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein kept digging, and the scandal started to unravel. The real turning point came when investigators discovered that Nixon had been secretly recording conversations in the Oval Office. Congress and prosecutors demanded that he hand over the tapes, but Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege, the idea that president had the right to keep certain communications private. That led to the landmark Supreme case, United States v. Nixon in 1974. The big question, does the president have unlimited executive privilege that allows him to withhold evidence in criminal investigations? The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Nixon must turn over the tapes, declaring that executive privilege does not apply when it's being used to obstruct justice. This was a huge check on presidential power. Once the tapes were released, the evidence was clear. Nixon had personally ordered the cover-up. The House of Reps moved to impeach him on charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Seeing the writing on the wall, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, before he could be removed from office. The final case we're going to be talking about today is the War Powers Act of 1973. Last but definitely not least, we have the War Powers Act of 1973. This law was designed to limit the president's ability to send U.S. troops into combat without congressional approval. It was a direct response to the Vietnam War, where Presidents Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon escalated U.S. military involvement without an official declaration of war from Congress. Under the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war, in Article 1, Section 8. But over the years, presidents have often sent troops into conflicts without formal approval in Korea, Vietnam, and later Iraq and Afghanistan. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, public frustration with the Vietnam War was growing, and Congress wanted to rein in presidential war powers. So in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, setting clear limits on how presidents can deploy the military. First, presidents must notify Congress within 48 hours of sending troops into combat. Second, troops cannot stay in combat for more than 60 days without congressional approval. And third, if Congress does not authorize continued military action, the president must withdraw troops within 30 days. This was a major legislative check on executive power. Nixon, unsurprisingly, vetoed the War Powers Act, arguing that it was unconstitutional and restricted his role as commander-in-chief. But Congress overrode his veto with a 2/3 majority, proving that no president, not even Nixon, could bypass the legislative branch on war decisions. Alright, let's take a look at some modern examples of checks and balances in action. The first was Biden's student loan forgiveness that was blocked in 2023. Biden wanted to forgive billions in student loans, but the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional and he did not have the power to do so, stopping the program. The next was the TikTok ban efforts from 2023 to 2024. Congress debated banning TikTok due to security concerns, but the courts challenged the ban over the First Amendment rights of the citizens. Alright, so we covered a lot today. So let's take a moment to bring it all together. First, we defined checks and balances. It's a system designed by the founding fathers to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. It works by ensuring that each branch, legislative, executive, and judicial, can check the powers of the other. Then we took a step back in history. Where did this idea come from? The answer is Montesquieu, who was a philosopher who first introduced the idea of separation of powers in 1748. The founding fathers adopted it after breaking away from the British monarchy, which had abused its unchecked powers. The US Constitution, written in 1787, put the system in action, when Federalist Number 51 in 1788 explained why it was so necessary. Later, the case Marbury versus Madison in 1803 established judicial review, giving the Supreme Court the power to strike down unconstitutional laws. Then we broke down how each of the branches checks each other. The legislative checks the executive by overriding vetoes, controlling funding, and impeaching the president. Legislative checks the judicial by confirming or rejecting justices and impeaching federal judges. Executive checks the legislative through vetoes, executive orders, and calling special sessions of Congress. Executive checks the judicial by nominating justices and ensuing pardons. Judicial checks the legislative through judicial review, declaring laws unconstitutional. Judicial checks the executive by ruling executive actions unconstitutional and presiding over impeachment trial. We then looked at some real-life examples that prove that checks and balances aren't just a theoretical issue. The first was Marbury v. Madison in 1803 that established judicial review and proved that the Supreme Court could check Congress and the president. The second was the Watergate scandal, which showed how Congress and the courts worked together to investigate and hold Nixon accountable. The last was the War Powers Act that limited the president's power to send troops without congressional approval. And we even explored modern examples like Biden's student loan forgiveness plan being blocked in 2023, showing the Supreme Court's ability to check executive power. And lastly, the TikTok ban efforts where Congress is checking the president's authority while also raising concerns about free speech. So why should you care? Well, checks and balances protect democracy by ensuring that no one person or branch has too much power. They might slow things down, but they prevent corruption, dictatorship, and abuse of power.
thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning about checks and balances from Anissa and Yeji. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on those post notifications. See ya!